The world did not end with a roar. At first, it simply exhaled. Across the great crescent from Egypt to Anatolia, a soft light clung to palaces, harbors, and old roads, as if the age itself were holding its breath. Everything looked steady, familiar, and warm, yet something subtle had already begun to shift beneath the calm. In this reimagined prelude to the late Bronze Age, the world appears as a vast tableau, softened by memory, its once brilliant edges now warmed by the last glow of an era nearing its quiet turn. Across the great arc stretching from Egypt to Anatolia, from Greece to Mesopotamia, life unfolds with a steadiness born of centuries. Palaces stand layered with old sunlight. Harbors breathe with the slow pulse of boats drifting in and out. And the familiar scent of grain hangs above fields that have yielded harvests for generations. Scribes sit in shaded courtyards, pressing neat wedges into damp clay, their hands moving with the calm certainty of people who trust the shape of tomorrow. Traders follow routes worn smooth by countless footsteps, guiding caravans through valleys, over ridges, and into cities whose gates have opened and closed in an unbroken rhythm for ages. Families cook over hearths that have burned in the same corner of the same home for longer than anyone can remember, the scent of bread rising like a reassurance that life will always continue as it has. Yet beneath the gentle routines and the layered confidence of an old order, small fractures begin to widen. A missed shipment here, a failed harvest there, a border skirmish that lasts longer than expected. Each event seems minor, but together they form a quiet trembling beneath the surface. In royal courts, messengers arrive a little too breathless. In distant villages, rumors move faster than the caravans that carry them. Some people sense that the world is shifting, though they cannot yet name the change. Most continue their days, believing the familiar rhythm will always hold. And so the age lingers at its quiet edge, suspended between what has endured and what is about to unravel. Along the riverbanks, fishermen haul their nets with motions inherited from their fathers, unaware that the waters connecting their towns may soon carry different stories. In markets, artisans carve patterns into ivory, bronze, and wood, trusting that buyers will come as they always have. High in the palaces, officials recite inventories of grain, copper, cedar, and oil, not knowing that the networks sustaining them are beginning to fray. This was a world that believed in its own continuity, a world so accustomed to its stability that even the earliest signs of change passed like shadows across its calm surface. And in that stillness, before collapse, before migration, before fire, the late Bronze Age glowed with the last light of a civilization preparing unknowingly to turn into history. The setting of the collapse, world growing unsteady. Around 1200 BCE, the vast lands surrounding the Mediterranean and Near East formed one of the most interconnected regions the ancient world had ever seen. Dozens of kingdoms, Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Ugarit, Cyprus, Canaanite city-states, and others, were linked together by a dense network of trade routes that crossed seas, deserts, and mountain passes. Bronze, the strategic metal of the age, moved from miner to smelter to workshop through a chain of merchants and caravans. Grain sailed over waters in long, sleek ships, and goods like cedar, tin, linen, olive oil, pottery, and precious dyes passed from hand to hand until they reached markets where scribes recorded each shipment with quiet confidence. In these decades before the collapse, the ancient world felt almost self-assured in its stability. Cities rose with shining walls, palaces buzzed with diplomatic letters, temples carried the soot of long-burning offerings. Every kingdom, whether large or small, believed that the order that held them together had always existed and would always endure. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, the first threads of disruption had already begun to loosen, though no one could yet see how far the unraveling would spread. Drought crept slowly across certain regions, tightening around harvests that once came reliably. Crops that should have filled granaries instead withered beneath unkind skies, and the resulting shortages sent subtle tremors through local economies. Farmers whispered that the seasons felt different. Shepherds noticed that the pastures stretched thinner. Traders found themselves haggling harder for grain that once flowed freely. For the moment, though, these disruptions felt manageable. After all, every civilization believed itself strong enough to weather a few difficult years. But the world of the late Bronze Age was more interconnected than it knew. Each kingdom relied on the next, economically, politically, and militarily. A missing shipment of grain from Cyprus might disrupt the rations of an army near Ugarit. A failed harvest in Anatolia might reduce the tribute the Hittite court expected from its vassals. A delayed caravan from Mesopotamia might halt a construction project in a Levantine city. Individually, each strain seemed small. Together they created a quiet tension that settled across the region like a slow fog. Trade routes that had once been symbols of cooperation gradually transformed into fragile lifelines. Armies needed bronze, and bronze needed tin, and tin traveled from far-off mountains through lands controlled by people who were not always friendly. When one link broke, others weakened. Diplomats noticed the delays, scribes recorded uneasy shortages, priests murmured anxiously in temple corridors. Yet even then, most believed the world's old rhythm would soon resume. However, the stresses continued to multiply. In some coastal regions, ships began arriving with stories of raids, swift attacks by groups who struck from the sea, burned warehouses, and disappeared as quickly as they came. These raiders, later known as the Sea Peoples in Egyptian inscriptions, were not yet an organized wave of destruction, but their presence added fear to an already fragile environment. Each kingdom hoped that the danger would pass, that the fires smoldering in distant harbors would not reach their own shores. At the same time, internal pressures grew. Palace systems depended on centralized authority. Kings, scribes, administrators, tax collectors, and elite officials whose power relied on the smooth flow of materials and information. When drought reduced harvests and trade routes faltered, these palatial structures strained under their own weight. Workers demanded rations that the palace could no longer guarantee. Local governors became restless. Soldiers, unpaid or underfed, grew more susceptible to rebellion or desertion. The very structure of these kingdoms, so impressive in times of abundance, proved vulnerable in times of scarcity. In some cities, records show moments of sudden fear. Letters sent urgently asking for grain, warnings that enemies were approaching, pleas for military support that never arrived in time. One of the most haunting examples comes from Ugarit, where a tablet preserved in ash records a desperate message from a king whose ally had not sent the ships or soldiers he desperately needed. "Our enemies are at the gates," the letter says in essence. "Send help quickly." but the help never came. The next layers of archaeological soil show the city burned and abandoned. Still, the collapse was not a single sweeping catastrophe. It unfolded unevenly, region by region, over decades. Some kingdoms fell early, others endured longer. Egypt survived, though battered. The Hittite Empire vanished almost completely. Mycenaean palaces burned. Cyprus was ravaged. Trade networks collapsed. Writing systems disappeared in certain areas, and small communities withdrew into simpler forms of life. What unified these events was not a single cause, but a convergence of pressures: climate change, migration, internal rebellion, famine, shifting trade patterns, technological transitions, and military conflict, all interacting in unpredictable ways. For people living through it, the collapse did not feel like a dramatic turning point, but rather a slow dimming of familiar lights. Farmers noticed their fields producing less. Traders found old partners gone or unreachable. Scribes reported fewer shipments and shorter inventories. Caravans traveled with increased caution. Markets that once overflowed with bronze goods gradually shifted to simpler materials. As copper supplies dwindled, the world felt unsteady. But few understood how close they stood to the edge of profound change. Across the Mediterranean, cities that had glowed with centuries of accumulated knowledge began to falter. Some survived by shrinking inward, retreating from trade, and relying on local production. Others were abandoned after fires or invasions. Refugees wandered through ruined landscapes, carrying with them memories of the old order that no longer made sense in the transformed world. Children grew up never knowing the palaces their parents had described. Patterns of life that had persisted for generations broke apart silently. And yet, even in this era of decline, small flashes of resilience endured. In certain regions, local communities adapted by cultivating new crops, relocating to defensible hilltops, or forming new alliances. Innovations such as ironworking, still in its early stages, began to gain importance as bronze became harder to obtain. Oral storytelling flourished where writing faded. Everyday people, farmers, sailors, herders, craftsmen, found ways to survive in a landscape where old certainties had crumbled. As the collapse deepened, the great web that once connected the kingdoms of the Bronze Age finally loosened beyond repair. Trade routes that had carried goods for centuries fell silent. Diplomatic ties dissolved. The flow of resources slowed to a trickle. Even the written word disappeared from some regions for generations. What remained were small, isolated communities living in the shadow of a world they could barely remember. In the soft stillness that followed, the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world drifted into a kind of quiet unfamiliarity. For those who lived through it, the collapse was not merely the end of a political order, but the fading of a way of life, an unraveling of the networks, knowledge, and rhythms that had shaped their parents and grandparents. And in the vacuum left behind, new cultures, new technologies, and new stories slowly emerged from the fragments. Thus, the late Bronze Age did not end with a single dramatic fall, but with the gradual erosion of the world's foundations, an erosion so subtle, so scattered across lands and lifetimes, that its people could only sense the changes without grasping their full scope. They looked at burned cities, empty granaries, silent harbors, and crumbling palaces, and they knew only that something vast had shifted. What had once been steady was now uncertain. What had once felt eternal was now slipping away. In the generations that followed, the echoes of that fading world shaped the dawn of new societies, rising quietly from the remnants of the old. Those who struggled to endure. In the long twilight of the late Bronze Age, the people who had built their lives upon the steady foundations of palaces, storerooms, and royal administrations were the ones who felt the first tremors of change most sharply. They had lived for generations within a system that promised stability in exchange for obedience, predictability in exchange for labor, and prosperity in exchange for loyalty. When the great machinery of that world began to slow, it did so unevenly, quietly at first, but deeply enough that those closest to its workings sensed the shift long before the landscape visibly changed. Kings, nobles, soldiers, scribes, farmers, merchants, and city dwellers all found themselves confronting disruptions they had never been taught to imagine. Their struggles formed the human thread that wove through the collapse, a testament to how ordinary lives can fracture when the structures holding them weaken. For the kings and nobles, the change arrived like a long shadow, stretching across their halls. Their authority had always rested on stable tribute from vassal territories, predictable harvests from royal fields, and the steady flow of bronze, grain, oil, and timber into palatial storerooms. When drought reduced crop yields and trade routes faltered, these rulers saw their wealth thinning not through immediate catastrophe, but through a slow decline that caused worry to collect like dust in the corners of their once bright chambers. Letters brought to them by anxious messengers spoke of delays, shortages, and minor rebellions, each small alone but ominous when viewed together. Grand halls that had echoed with proclamations began to echo with uncertainty. The nobility, accustomed to a world that rewarded birthright with comfort, found themselves bargaining, stretching resources, and clinging to authority that felt increasingly fragile. Armies, too, were among the first to feel the strain. Soldiering in the Bronze Age depended on constant supplies, bronze weapons, well-kept chariots, trained horses, and ample food. An army without grain was less an army than a fleeing crowd. An army without bronze was merely a group of men carrying sticks. As harvests weakened and foreign shipments stalled, military provisions became erratic. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline among soldiers, whose wages arrived late and whose rations grew thinner by the month. Some units mutinied, others deserted. Still others stayed loyal out of tradition, even as their equipment broke down. The once precise movement of regiments grew ragged, and the great armies that had once marched across deserts and plains with confidence now hesitated, uncertain whether the lands ahead held enemies, empty fields, or smoldering ruins. Behind these visible forces stood the scribes, whose quiet presence had long sustained the administrative heart of the age. Their tablets recorded every exchange, every shipment, every diplomatic correspondence. They preserved languages, contracts, myths, and the steady breathing of palace bureaucracy. But scribal work required stability, time, training, resources, and the assurance that their writing mattered. When turmoil disrupted daily life, the scribe's role dimmed. Clay became scarce, administrative orders came less frequently, and the long schooling required to master cuneiform or hieratic suddenly seemed impractical in a world where survival depended more on food than literacy. Some scribes clung to their craft, continuing to press signs into clay even as their cities faltered. Others, abandoned their styluses to take up more immediately useful work. In some regions, writing itself faded for generations, leaving behind only echoes of a vanished intellectual world. Farmers, the foundation upon which all palatial wealth rested, bore the collapse with a quiet endurance that often slipped unnoticed into the margins of history. Their lives were always tied to the land, and when the land changed, so did their fate. Drought-strained irrigation systems that had worked reliably for centuries. Rivers shifted their courses, sometimes inch by inch, sometimes suddenly after storms, disrupting the delicate canals that fed fields of barley and wheat. When harvests shrank, farmers faced impossible choices: remain and hope the next season would be kinder, or abandon ancestral lands in search of more forgiving soil. Many stayed, driven by memory and habit. Others joined the waves of movement that slowly reshaped the region. Their silent struggles, cracked earth, dying livestock, shrinking granaries, formed one of the deepest layers of the collapse, a hardship measured not in dramatic events but in the daily weight of survival. City dwellers, dependent on rural surplus, found themselves equally vulnerable. Cities had long been centers of craft, trade, and administration, thriving because the countryside fed them. When farmers faced scarcity, urban markets thinned, bakeries produced smaller loaves, merchants received fewer goods. Workshops that once echoed with the ringing of metal and the carving of ivory grew quiet. Families who had relied on steady wages found themselves bartering for basic necessities. In some places, urban neighborhoods emptied as residents fled either outward to rural areas or inward toward fortified centers, offering protection. Streets that had once held processions, festivals, and trade now echoed with a stillness so profound that later archaeologists would find layers of ash and debris where life had simply stopped. The merchants who connected these worlds, traveling between ports, oases, and city gates, felt their networks crumble in real time. Routes they had followed for decades suddenly became dangerous, not because of one great enemy, but because of many small, unpredictable disruptions. A harbor raided here, a caravan attacked there, a border controlled by new strangers. Each shift forced merchants to adapt, reroute, or retreat. As trade collapsed, so too did the relationships that underpinned it. Partnerships, promises, and the flow of trust that once united distant lands. The silence of abandoned ports marked not just the end of commerce, but the end of a shared world. Even artisans, bronze workers, potters, weavers, carpenters, felt the tightening grip of uncertainty. Bronze smiths in particular faced a crisis, for their craft depended on tin imported across enormous distances. As supplies slowed or vanished, they were forced to conserve, repurpose, or cease production altogether. Potters adapted more easily, but even they struggled when grain shortages meant fewer customers had resources for anything beyond essentials. In some communities, artisans turned to new materials like iron, experimenting with techniques that would shape future eras. But during the collapse, most felt the strain of a world shifting beneath their feet. Ultimately, the people who struggled to endure were those bound most tightly to the old structures, those whose daily rhythms and livelihoods depended on systems that were weakening. Kings and nobles faced shrinking authority. Armies trudged through uneven supplies. Scribes watched their intellectual world dim. Farmers confronted failing fields. City dwellers saw markets empty. Merchants lost their networks. Artisans lost their materials. Each group carried a piece of the collapse. not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow hollowing of the world they had known. And yet, within their struggles, lay the first seeds of adaptation. The collapse did not erase humanity, it reshaped it. Those who survived learned to live with less, to rebuild from fragments, to craft new communities in the shadow of the old. Their endurance, quiet, persistent, and often invisible, formed the bridge between the world that fell and the world that would rise after it. Top of form. Paths of survival. The slow turning toward new ways. When the world of the late Bronze Age began to waver, the collapse did not fall on every community in the same way. The great palaces and cities with their long corridors, storehouses, archives, and armies had been built for stability, not flexibility. Their scale, once their strength, became a burden when the old systems faltered. But beyond the fading light of the palatial centers, there were people, families, villages, and wandering groups who looked at the same darkening horizon and quietly adjusted their steps. Their survival unfolded through slow, practical decisions made day after day, guided not by strategy or prophecy, but by instinct, necessity, and the shared memory of how their ancestors had lived before the world grew so complicated. These adaptations created broad paths, 3 slow-turning ways that helped people move through the long dusk of the collapse and into the first uncertain dawn of a new age. The first path belonged to those who stayed in place but changed the way they lived. These were the settled farmers, the village communities, and the small-scale shepherds whose lives had always been anchored to familiar soil. When irrigation channels dried or shifted, they dug new ditches. When harvests shrank, they altered their crops, turning from barley or wheat to hardy grains that tolerated poorer conditions. Some villages rebuilt themselves closer to springs or higher ground. Houses grew smaller and simpler. Tools became more practical, made from materials that did not require long-distance trade. This was a path of contraction rather than flight, a narrowing of expectation, a slow reshaping of daily life around what the land could still offer. It was not easy. Many seasons were uncertain, but these communities possessed something the palaces had forgotten: resilience born from watching the land closely and adjusting to its shifts with patience. Over generations, the villages that endured became centers of small but steady life, proving that survival sometimes meant drawing inward rather than outward. The second path belonged to those who embraced movement. These were traders, herders, displaced families, and wandering groups who discovered that mobility offered freedoms unavailable to the anchored. As trade routes fractured, some merchants became itinerant peddlers rather than long-distance transporters, shifting from major caravans to smaller, flexible circuits. Herding families moved more frequently, following patterns of grass and weather that changed year by year. Groups who fled burned cities or failing harvests became travelers by necessity, forming temporary encampments along rivers and in valleys that had once been quiet. Some of these mobile groups later appeared in the records of surviving kingdoms as migrants, raiders, negotiators, or new settlers. Others disappeared into the landscape, leaving only faint archaeological traces: broken pottery, hearthstones, worn paths, marking the roots of people who learned to live by moving. Their survival emerged from loosened boundaries, from stepping away from the shrinking world of palaces and choosing to live between spaces rather than within fixed walls. The third path belonged to communities that reorganized entirely, not by staying in place or wandering, but by building new forms of life from the remnants of the old. These groups established hilltop towns, fortified villages, or cluster settlements where defense and cooperation mattered more than scale or prestige. They redefined identity through shared hardship rather than ancestral hierarchy. Leadership shifted from kings to councils, elders, or small coalitions. Without access to bronze, they turned increasingly to iron, learning to forge tools and weapons that required less imported material. Skilled artisans taught others how to work new metals. Farmers experimented with mixed agriculture. Families pooled their labor. In place of distant palatial oversight, these communities built resilience through local networks, trust, proximity, shared watchfulness. Over time, some of these reorganized groups formed the seeds of later cultures, carrying forward the lessons of collapse in their structures, traditions, and ways of living. Across all three paths, survival was not a single choice, but a series of small adaptations made repeatedly. A farmer decided to plant a different seed. A herder chose a new grazing route. A family left the ruins of a city for a ridge with better vantage points. A craftsman experimented with a new metal. Each action was small, but collectively, they created the slow-turning shift that allowed people to live through the uncertainty. None of these groups had the luxury of imagining themselves as participants in a grand historical transformation. To them, survival was simply the continuation of daily life, feeding children, repairing roofs, storing grain, avoiding conflict, and adjusting to conditions that changed without warning. What united these varied paths was not their sameness, but their shared recognition that the old world was not returning. Those who survived did not wait for the palaces to rebuild or for the ancient trade networks to reawaken. They did not cling to the rituals of diplomacy, the lists of tribute, or the familiar cycles of bureaucracy. Instead, they found stability in smaller systems: family, village, local trade, herding routes, fortified hamlets. They moved away from dependency on far-reaching networks toward tighter, more flexible communities. In doing so, they created ways of life better suited to a world that had lost its grand scale. The slow turning toward new ways was not heroic or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and rooted in the textures of daily necessity. Children grew up learning a simpler world. Storytellers adapted old myths to new landscapes. Tools changed in shape. Dwellings shifted in design. Livelihoods bent toward practicality. And although the memories of the Great Bronze Age lingered, of shining palaces, vast ships, and distant kingdoms, these memories softened across generations, becoming stories of a world that seemed almost too large to believe. The people who followed the three paths of survival carried fragments of that earlier age within them, but they did not rely on its structures. Instead, they built lives that learned from the collapse rather than resisted it. In the end, these quiet survivors formed the bridge between eras. Through their choices, staying, moving, reorganizing, they shaped the early Iron Age and set the foundations for new cultures, languages, and identities. The collapse had taken away the certainty of the old world, but the people who adapted created a different kind of strength, one based not on grand systems but on communities capable of bending without breaking. Their endurance, though often overlooked, was the slow turning that allowed humanity to continue when the great machinery of the Bronze Age fell silent. Path 1, remaining within the old frameworks. Among the many regions touched by the slow unraveling of the late Bronze Age, there were places that endured not by abandoning the old structures, nor by reinventing themselves entirely, but by retreating into the core of what had always sustained them. Egypt stood foremost among these, a civilization whose identity, strength, and longevity were shaped not only by its rulers, but by the unchanging geography that held its people together. When the old world around it began to fracture, Egypt survived by contracting inward, by preserving its essential rhythms, and by trusting that the Nile, the ancient giver of life, would continue its steady pulse, even as the rest of the Mediterranean fell into disarray. Egypt's geography was its greatest ally. While other lands depended on shifting trade routes, variable rains, or long-distance networks for grain, metal, and protection, Egypt's lifeline flowed through its heart every year. The Nile flooded with a rhythm older than any dynasty, spreading dark silt across fields that had been farmed since the first kings united Upper and Lower Egypt. Even when famine struck or court politics faltered, the river remained. Its presence offered a kind of stability that palaces and armies elsewhere could not replicate. As long as the Nile rose, the farmlands on its banks could support villages, towns, and the administrative centers that still functioned, slower, smaller, but alive. Yet survival did not come without cost. Egypt of this era was not the Egypt of grand monuments, wide campaigns, or golden splendor. The collapse of neighboring civilizations forced Egypt into a position of strain that required both discipline and retreat. Pharaohs tightened the machinery of the state, reducing the scale of foreign ambition and focusing instead on protecting their core territory. Border garrisons were strengthened. Supply chains along the Nile were regulated with greater care. The military took on an outsized role, not because Egypt planned conquest, but because the threats of migration, sea raiders, and destabilized neighbors meant that vigilance became essential for survival. Diplomacy also changed. The great correspondence networks that once linked Egypt to the Hittites, Babylonians, Mycenaeans, and Canaanite rulers grew thin as foreign courts collapsed or were abandoned. Letters that had once arrived wrapped in clay seals, filled with formal greetings and requests for gold or grain, dwindled until silence replaced conversation. Egypt, which had once stood at the center of an international world, now found itself one of the few remaining participants. The absence of its old partners forced the state to turn inward, maintaining only what was necessary to keep the administrative heart beating. Within this shifting landscape, Egypt's people adapted quietly. Farmers continued to plant along the Nile, relying on traditions embedded deeply within their communities. Scribes maintained records, though fewer than before. Temples conducted rituals, though without the abundant donations that had once filled their storerooms. Craftsmen worked with materials that could be sourced locally, and when bronze became scarce, they gradually shifted toward iron or simpler tools. Cities shrank, not into ruins but into modest versions of themselves, maintaining their essential structure while letting go of the grandeur of earlier centuries. One of the most striking features of Egypt's survival was that it endured the collapse while preserving its governmental framework. Where the Hittite Empire crumbled entirely, where Ugarit fell to fire, where Mycenaean palaces collapsed one after another, Egypt held onto the pillars of its state. The pharaoh, the priesthood, the scribal class, the army, and the agricultural engine of the Nile Valley. These pillars did not remain unchanged, but they did not break. Instead, they bent under the pressure, absorbed the impact of regional chaos, and adapted themselves to a world that no longer rewarded grand building projects or wide-reaching networks. Egypt's cultural identity also shifted. The artistic brilliance of past dynasties gave way to quieter craftsmanship. Monumental architecture slowed nearly to a halt, not because the Egyptians lacked skill, but because the resources needed for such undertakings now had to be directed towards sustenance and defense. Temples aged without major renovations. Tombs were built with less extravagance. Luxurious goods that had once flowed from distant lands became rare, replaced by local substitutes or simpler items. And yet, despite this dimming of outward splendor, the internal coherence of Egyptian religion, language, and social order remained strong enough to carry the civilization forward. As neighbors fell, Egypt witnessed waves of movement along its borders. Peoples displaced from collapsing societies, raiders seeking footholds, migrants looking for stability. Some were repelled by military action. Others were absorbed into Egyptian society as laborers, mercenaries, or settlers. This blending of peoples, although sometimes tumultuous, became part of Egypt's adaptation strategy. By incorporating newcomers into its system rather than rejecting them entirely, Egypt maintained both manpower and cultural vitality. The world had shifted, and Egypt shifted with it, not radically, but gradually, with a kind of pragmatic patience. The state, recognizing its diminished position on the international stage, focused on protecting its internal infrastructure. Irrigation networks were maintained with careful oversight. Grain storage became more systematized, serving as a buffer against future shortages. Local officials were granted slightly more autonomy as long as they upheld the essential functions of the state. The pharaoh's authority, though symbolically upheld, operated with a quieter tone, less triumphant declaration, more administrative resiliency. Egypt's endurance through the collapse was not a story of triumph, but of survival through contraction and discipline. It preserved what mattered most by releasing the parts of itself that belonged to a different age. Its borders tightened, its ambitions shrank, its monuments stood unchanged, not because of ongoing glory, but because resources had to be redirected to maintain life, not beauty. Even so, Egypt remained a rare point of stability. In a region where cities burned, trade collapsed, and writing disappeared. In the centuries that followed, Egypt's cultural memory of the Bronze Age lingered like a soft echo. Stories of glorious campaigns, foreign princes kneeling before pharaohs, and golden ages of monumental construction. But those memories belonged to the world before the collapse. The Egypt that survived into the early Iron Age was quieter, smaller, and more cautious. It had endured, not by expanding, but by holding on to its core, the Nile, the administrative heartland, the disciplined structure of its state, and the resilience of its people. And in that endurance there was a lesson shared by no other surviving power of the age, that sometimes the path through collapse is not transformation, not flight, and not reinvention, but a careful, deliberate commitment to what has always sustained life: geography, community, and the quiet strength of continuity. Path 2. Movements from the Highlands and open steppes. In the long dusk of the late Bronze Age, while great kingdoms struggled to preserve their shrinking frameworks, another path toward survival emerged from the Highlands and open steppes that rimmed the old empires. These were regions that had never depended on palatial systems, far-reaching trade routes, or monumental cities. Their communities lived close to the rhythms of wind, pasture, sparse soil, and the lean strength of animals that had long shaped their way of life. When the lowland kingdoms faltered, when storehouses emptied and administrative centers dimmed, these highland and steppe peoples did not face the same collapse. Instead, they encountered an expanding horizon. The softening of imperial borders opened new possibilities, and the adaptability that had always defined their world became a quiet force capable of reshaping entire regions. Life in the mountains had never promised ease. The soil was thin, the slopes steep, the climate unpredictable. Communities learned to survive through mobility, cooperation, and a realism honed by generations of living in places where crops often failed and winters arrived without warning. Their herds were their wealth, their movement, their security. A village might settle for a season or two, but rarely for long. The land demanded flexibility. Clan networks rather than bureaucratic administrations held society together. Decisions were made around fires, not in archives. Leadership emerged from reputation, not birthright or palace decree. And because their world had never relied on the fragile complexity that defined the lowland empires, the stresses that fractured those great states did not shake the Highlands in the same way. As the palatial centers weakened, routes that had once been guarded or taxed became open terrain. Fertile valleys, once claimed by distant kings, now lacked overseers. Border fortresses, understaffed or abandoned, no longer blocked movement. The silence left by deepening collapse was an invitation, not openly announced but widely felt. Highland groups sensed opportunity in the emptiness, not as conquerors seeking glory, but as survivors accustomed to following whatever path allowed life to continue. They moved downward with a steady confidence, bringing their flocks, tools, and families into lands long denied to them. Some arrived peacefully, settling beside shrinking villages that welcomed new hands. Others appeared as raiders, testing defenses weakened by famine or disorder. Most simply followed the logic of survival, drifting into lands where pasture was richer and conflict less certain. Their presence reshaped entire landscapes, not through sudden conquest, but through persistent movement. One of the greatest strengths of these highland and steppe groups was their minimal dependency on external supplies. While lowland kingdoms required shipments of grain, metal, and tribute to sustain their systems, highland societies needed only what they could produce, carry, or herd. Their economy rested on wool, meat, milk, hides, simple pottery, and small-scale metalwork, goods they could transport easily, adapt quickly, and exchange without relying on complex networks. When drought or disruption struck, they simply shifted routes or moved to new valleys. Their entire worldview embraced adaptation not as a crisis, but as a natural part of life. This mobility created a resilience that seemed almost invisible when empires were strong, but became undeniable once the great centers faltered. As these groups descended into weakened regions, their interactions with local populations formed a spectrum. In some areas, they integrated gradually, settling on the edges of old towns, offering labor, herding knowledge, and fresh networks of small-scale trade. Their presence revitalized pockets of the countryside, filling spaces left empty by migration or famine. In other places, movement led to tension. Groups accustomed to open pasture clashed with farming communities who still tried to maintain their shrinking fields. But even in conflict, the Highlanders possessed an advantage. They were used to hardship. Their social structures were simple enough to endure loss, and their flexibility made them difficult to suppress. Over time, the patterns of their movement shaped new cultural blends. Languages merged, tools shifted in design. Local traditions absorbed Highland practices, especially in herding, warfare, and small-scale craftsmanship. Highland groups adopted certain lowland customs while discarding the ones unsuited to their lifestyle. This gradual blending produced communities neither entirely rural nor entirely pastoral, societies forged from the friction and cooperation between people who had lived in mountains for generations and those who had tried to preserve the old ways in the valleys. Many of the early Iron Age cultures that later emerged in the region bore the imprint of this mixture, their identity shaped not by palatial centers, but by resilient communities forged through mobility. One remarkable aspect of these groups was their relationship to technology. While bronze was scarce in collapsing kingdoms, Highland communities had long relied on simpler metal tools. As bronze supplies dwindled, iron, once rare and difficult to work, became increasingly important. And it was often the mobile groups, with their willingness to adopt new methods and their need for durable tools, who accelerated this technological transition. Iron weapons and implements allowed them to navigate new terrains with confidence, defend their herds, and carve out stable footholds in lands where older societies struggled. Their willingness to experiment gave them an advantage that helped define the next era. Socially, their flexibility created systems that could adjust far faster than the rigid hierarchies of older empires. Authority was personal rather than institutional. Leaders were chosen for skill, charisma, or wisdom, rather than lineage. Communities could split or merge depending on seasons, conflict, or opportunity. This fluidity allowed them to thread through the fractures of collapsing states, filling gaps left by diminishing administrations. While old kingdoms tried desperately to maintain their protocols, Highland societies simply acted, moving, settling, adapting, without needing permission or complex organization. In regions once held by empires like the Hittites, the highland and steppe groups became the new inhabitants of burned cities and abandoned farmlands. Some rebuilt in their own style, creating modest fortified settlements on ridges or near rivers. Others allowed ruins to remain as they grazed animals in the fields that once fed armies. They did not restore the past. They reshaped the landscape according to their needs, leaving behind a patchwork of new communities that bore little resemblance to the monumental order that came before. The world they formed was smaller in scale but more resilient, unburdened by the weight of vast bureaucracies. By the time the collapse reached its quiet conclusion, these mobile groups had woven themselves into the fabric of the new age. They were no longer simply Highlanders or steppe wanderers, but key participants in the emerging Iron Age world. Their movements created new routes of exchange, their settlements seeded later nations, and their adaptability became the foundation for societies that could endure uncertainty. In the end, the path of mobility, once viewed as marginal by the great empires, proved to be one of the surest ways to survive the long twilight of the Bronze Age. Path 3. Those who change their roles with the wind. Among the many groups navigating the quiet collapse of the late Bronze Age, few adapted with as much subtle ingenuity as the merchants, travelers, and small coastal or island communities scattered along the edges of the great inland seas. Unlike the palatial centers anchored to rigid systems, these smaller societies had always lived with movement, uncertainty, and the shifting patterns of wind and tide. Their lives were shaped not by the grandeur of empires, but by the rhythms of boats slipping over water, caravans threading narrow passes, island villages exchanging goods across short channels, and travelers whose memory of routes stretched farther than any royal map. When the old world dimmed, these groups did not break. Instead, they turned with the wind, altering their roles, adjusting their routes, reshaping their livelihoods with the same quiet flexibility that had long allowed them to survive at the margins of powerful realms. Merchants were among the first to sense that the distances of the old world were shrinking. They had traveled too long and too far not to notice when certain harbors grew silent, when guards abandoned checkpoints, when caravans that once stretched for miles dwindled to a handful of wary participants. For generations, merchants had been the threads tying together Egypt, Cyprus, Canaan, Ugarit, the Aegean Islands, and the Anatolian coast. Their boats carried copper, tin, olive oil, wine, textiles, and carved goods. Their caravans bore stories and rumors, along with physical cargo. When the collapse began to fray these connections, merchants adapted almost instinctively. Long-distance routes gave way to shorter circuits. Goods once shipped across seas were traded across bays or narrow straits. Instead of grand markets, merchants sought out modest coastal settlements, island harbors, or inland villages still capable of small exchanges. Their knowledge of winds, reefs, currents, and hidden pathways allowed them to avoid danger and find opportunity even when empires fell quiet. Travelers, messengers, itinerant craft workers, healers, musicians also found new patterns emerging in familiar landscapes. Their world had always been fluid, its stability lying in movement rather than destination. When roads became unsafe, they shifted to inland paths. When inland areas grew hostile, they followed the coasts. Every turn of the route created new opportunities. A village lacking a potter could welcome a wandering craftsman. A hamlet damaged by conflict might rely on a traveling healer. A coastal town short of news would eagerly listen to a storyteller passing through. These travelers changed roles constantly, becoming whatever the moment required. Their adaptability echoed the broader transformation of the age, people stepping into new identities as old structures dissolved. Small coastal and island communities, often overlooked in the grand narratives of empire, displayed some of the most effective forms of resilience. Their lives were shaped not by monumental architecture or vast fields, but by boats, fishing grounds, and rocky soil that demanded cooperation and restraint. Because they relied less on palace systems, their collapse was less abrupt. They organized themselves through kinship, shared labor, and communal watchfulness. When dangerous ships appeared on the horizon, they prepared defenses through simple but effective means: lookouts, quick signal fires, and collective action. When storms altered coastlines or fishing grounds shifted, they redistributed labor and resources. Their survival depended on awareness, adaptability, and trust, qualities that made them surprisingly strong as larger kingdoms faltered. One of the most notable transformations occurred among the maritime traders of the Eastern Mediterranean, who began altering not only the distances they traveled, but the goods they carried. Instead of depending on bronze-related materials, tin, copper, and the networks that supplied them, they shifted toward items drawn from local resources: fish, salt, herbs, timber, wool, clay vessels, and simple tools. Their cargo became lighter, more varied, and more flexible. In doing so, they stepped away from the long, fragile chains that had sustained Bronze Age elites and constructed a new economic rhythm better suited to uncertainty. They changed with the needs of the era, moving in quiet partnership with the shifting coastline of history. Coastal communities in particular discovered that survival lay in strengthening local initiative. Without bureaucratic oversight, islands and small settlements created systems of mutual aid. Fishing boats became defensive patrols when needed. Communal storage pits replaced palace granaries. Skills once specialized became shared across families. Rope making, boat repair, simple smithing, and drying fish for long-term storage. Such skills made them less dependent on distant centers and more capable of meeting needs from within. Their worlds were smaller, yes, but their resilience was greater, precisely because they did not rely on the towering systems that had collapsed elsewhere. Even their social roles shifted. Leaders emerged from experience rather than lineage. Councils formed from elders, sailors, fishers, and craft workers whose daily involvement gave them insight into the needs of the community. Cooperation became more important than hierarchy. In place of the rigid structures that had weakened the great kingdoms, these coastal and island societies built flexible frameworks, able to bend with storms both literal and political. Their sense of identity deepened, not from imperial association, but from the shared struggle of maintaining continuity in a changing world. Merchants and seafarers also played a subtle but essential role as carriers of culture during the collapse. As they moved between harbors and islands, they spread stories, songs, technologies, and fragments of distant traditions. Even when writing systems faded in some regions, oral networks thrived. A boat arriving at a small harbor might bring news of a burned city, or a new tool, or a story told in a different dialect that slowly shaped local narratives. In this way, the traveling groups became bridges between fading cultures, preserving continuity through memory and movement, rather than through bureaucratic records. Over time, the adaptability of these groups allowed them to anchor themselves in the emerging Iron Age world. Their communities became hubs of exchange for new materials, especially iron, which began to spread not through royal decree, but through the hands of itinerant smiths and small-scale traders. Their knowledge of winds and seasons continued to guide maritime routes long after the palatial systems vanished. Their flexibility in roles, being merchants one season, fishers the next, small-scale farmers, or defenders when needed, gave them a strength more robust than the rigid structures of earlier empires. By the time the collapse settled into its long aftermath, these groups had woven quiet but lasting threads into the new age. Their small worlds survived because they never depended on largeness. Their communities endured because they shaped themselves constantly, like water responding to the shape of stone. Their roles shifted with the winds, with the currents, with the needs of the moment. And in their adaptability lay a quiet truth. That continuity is not always found in strength or complexity, but in the willingness to change shape while holding on to the core of what makes life possible. In this way, the merchants, travelers, and small coastal or island communities carried the memory of the old world across the threshold of the new, not by preserving its grandeur, but by sustaining its spirit of exchange, connection, and resilience. Their gentle transformations, their shifting identities, and their steady movement through uncertain waters formed one of the most enduring paths of survival. Proof that when the greater systems fail, it is often the smaller, more flexible communities that keep the light from disappearing. Lessons from the dust of empires. When the Bronze Age slipped into its long unraveling, the world that emerged from its dust did not form in a single moment, nor through the vision of any one kingdom, ruler, or wandering group. Instead, it emerged slowly, shaped by countless hands, farmers who stayed on struggling land, merchants who altered their routes, wandering groups who settled new valleys, and island communities who kept their worlds stitched together through trust and shared labor. Across these shifting landscapes, a clear pattern began to take form, one that reveals something enduring about human history. Collapse does not erase humanity. It reshapes it, dispersing old certainties and allowing new forms to rise quietly from the spaces left behind. As the great palatial systems dimmed, the first lesson to emerge was that complexity without resilience is fragile. The Bronze Age kingdoms had built their power through wide trade networks, specialized labor, bureaucratic hierarchies, and a metal that depended on two ingredients found in far-flung lands. Their glory was built on distance. When the flow of tin faltered, when drought squeezed harvests, when ships failed to arrive, the magnificent machinery that had held these kingdoms together began to crack. The collapse revealed that societies anchored too tightly to specific systems, monumental architecture, elaborate administration, fragile supply routes, could not withstand long disruptions. Their beauty was undeniable, but their endurance was limited. From the dust of these systems came a second lesson. Smallness can be a strength when the world grows uncertain. Communities that survived were often those with simple, flexible structures, village councils rather than palace bureaucracies, herding groups rather than centralized armies, fishermen who knew the tides rather than nobles who knew diplomacy. These societies could shift with changing conditions because they had long lived in partnership with unpredictability. Their resilience was not dramatic. It was woven into their daily habits, allowing them to adjust course without losing themselves in the process. Instead of grandeur, they carried wisdom. Instead of scale, they carried adaptability. A third lesson emerged through the transformation of material culture. The rise of iron was not a glorious technological revolution born of discovery, but a humble necessity shaped by scarcity. Bronze weakened not because people forgot its value, but because the networks required to create it had frayed. Tin grew far harder to obtain, while iron, though difficult to work and initially inferior, was available in many hills and mountains. Its adoption was uneven and gradual, carried not by kings commissioning new weapons, but by local smiths, herders, wanderers, and small communities experimenting with what they had at hand. Iron spread because it was practical, and from that practicality came an entirely new age. The world that rose after the Bronze Age was forged not in palaces but in modest workshops where necessity guided innovation. A fourth lesson came from the reshaping of political identity. As the great empires receded, smaller kingdoms and chiefdoms rose in their place, not as substitutes attempting to rebuild the past, but as new forms suited to the era's conditions. Leadership shifted from monumental to local, from centralized to communal. In some regions, councils made decisions previously reserved for royal courts. In others, fortified hilltop towns replaced sprawling capitals. These new political forms carried the imprint of survival, modest scale, local resources, cooperation, and an awareness of vulnerability. Their strength came not from commanding vast territories, but from understanding the land beneath their feet. A fifth lesson revealed itself in the quieter rhythms that followed the collapse. The interconnected world of the late Bronze Age, rich letters exchanged between kings, shared artistic motifs, long-distance marriages, coordinated diplomacy, dissolved into regional spheres. But this fragmentation was not the end of connection. It was the beginning of new networks, smaller but more suited to their environment. Each region adapted according to its own needs. Egypt tightened inward, the Levant reorganized, Greek communities downshifted into simpler forms that would later give rise to the polis, the Highlands filled with new settlers, islands preserved trade in miniature. The old world had been unified by hierarchy. The new world was shaped by local initiative. A sixth lesson lay in memory. People did not forget the palaces entirely. The stories of former kings, the echoes of monumental architecture, the fragments of writing systems, they lingered as reminders of a time that once felt eternal. But memory softened, becoming a guide rather than a blueprint. Instead of attempting to rebuild what had fallen, people carried the lessons forward. They took what could endure: techniques, stories, small rituals, fragments of identity, and wove them into the new societies they were forming. Memory did not hold them captive. It enriched their steps into the Iron Age. A seventh lesson came from movement itself. Many groups survived because they allowed themselves to shift, whether across mountains, along coasts, or through trade networks adjusted to shorter distances. This movement created a flow of knowledge, songs, tools, pottery styles, weaving patterns, oral histories that connected communities even without the formal diplomacy of earlier ages. The collapse may have ended the grand interconnected world of the Bronze Age, but it also allowed new cultural blends to emerge, shaped by the mingling of migrants and locals, highlanders and farmers, sailors and herders. In the dust of empires, diversity grew. An eighth lesson rose from the recognition that collapse does not destroy meaning, it redistributes it. The monumental temples, palaces, and archives that once defined civilization gave way to homes, workshops, boats, small shrines, and shared fields. Meaning moved from the grand to the intimate. Rituals became local, crafts became communal, knowledge became practical. The world narrowed in scale but deepened in texture. What emerged was not a lesser civilization, but a different one in which survival was a shared act rather than an imperial design. A ninth lesson lies in the quiet truth that humanity's greatest strength is not stability but adaptability. The Bronze Age had been remarkable because of its scale, but the age that followed endured because ordinary people, farmers, smiths, sailors, herders, potters, merchants, adjusted their work and their lives without waiting for kings to act. Civilization did not fall, it changed hands. It became decentralized, distributed among the many rather than concentrated in the few. This shift laid the groundwork for the cultural flowering that would eventually follow centuries later. And finally, the last lesson from the dust of empires is this: endings are not empty. They clear the space in which new worlds take root. The collapse of the Bronze Age closed one of humanity's great chapters, but in the quiet that followed, countless communities reshaped the future in ways they could not yet see. New languages emerged, rising from older dialects like fresh shoots from ancient soil. New trade patterns formed, following shorter paths through safer regions. New political forms appeared, carrying forward lessons learned through hardship. The old, interconnected world dissolved, but its echoes shaped every society that followed. In this way, the Bronze Age collapse teaches not despair, but continuity. Continuity through transformation, through the resilience of small communities, through the persistence of memory, and through the unbroken human ability to begin again when the dust settles and the horizon shifts. The value of flexibility in uncertain times. In the lingering twilight of the late Bronze Age, one lesson grew unmistakably clear. The groups that endured were those able to loosen their hold on what had once seemed permanent. The world that preceded the collapse had been built on foundations of tradition, ritual, long-distance exchange, and centralized authority. For centuries, these systems appeared immovable, their continuity guaranteed by the weight of custom and the power of palace administrations. But when the networks that sustained them began to fray, rigidity became a liability. What had once been strength, large bureaucracies, fixed trade routes, elaborate hierarchies, transformed into burdens too heavy to carry through a world undergoing transformation. Flexibility, not stability, emerged as the defining virtue of those who survived. Across the Mediterranean and Near East, communities learned that survival demanded a willingness to shift roles, routes, and expectations. Mobility became a quiet form of power, allowing groups to navigate around dangers rather than confront them directly. Herders moved their flocks to new grazing lands when old pastures failed. Small coastal communities adjusted their fishing or trading patterns when storms or raiders made familiar routes unsafe. Even village farmers, often seen as the most rooted members of society, adapted by altering crops, reorganizing irrigation, or relocating closer to defensible ground. These adjustments were not dramatic revolutions. They were simple acts of realism, choices shaped by the awareness that the world no longer followed predictable rhythms. Diverse skills proved just as valuable as mobility. In earlier centuries, specialized labor supported palatial economies. Scribes wrote, merchants traded, farmers farmed, artisans crafted, soldiers defended. But as the collapse disrupted these roles, communities able to distribute knowledge widely held an advantage. A village where many people could fish, farm, mend tools, navigate hills, or repair boats proved far more resilient than one dependent on a narrow set of skills. Specialization, once the hallmark of sophisticated society, became fragile when supply routes broke. Flexibility in skill meant flexibility in survival, allowing people to shift from one livelihood to another as circumstances required. Distributed systems also offered protection when centralized ones faltered. The Great Bronze Age states relied on palace granaries, royal treasuries, long-distance tribute, and administrative oversight to maintain order. When drought, famine, or conflict disrupted these systems, collapse followed swiftly. But communities with smaller, locally managed stores of food, shared responsibilities, and communal decision-making weathered hardships better. Their survival did not depend on a distant authority sending aid or enforcing structure. Instead, Resilience grew from local cooperation, families pooling grain, fishermen sharing nets, elders guiding settlements through change, artisans working with whatever materials remained at hand. This distributed resilience explains why many small island communities, mountain villages, and coastal settlements endured while powerful kingdoms fell. Their ability to bend, to adapt their identity, their work, and their expectations meant that they could continue even when their world narrowed. Their lives were simple, but simple systems break less easily. They could adjust to scarcity, shift their attention to new resources, reorganize leadership, or work together to repel threats. These changes were not expressions of strength in the traditional sense. They were expressions of adaptability, a deeper strength forged through familiarity with uncertainty. As the collapse stretched across decades, the societies that survived gradually shaped the early Iron Age. This transition did not involve an abrupt leap into new technology, but a slow recognition that iron, though harder to work initially, offered independence from long-distance tin trade. Communities that adapted to iron could forge tools locally, strengthening their autonomy. Likewise, smaller centers of power emerged, each molded by its environment and circumstances, rather than by imperial directives. Some grew around fortified hilltops, others around river crossings, coastal inlets, or fertile valleys. Without the sweeping reach of Bronze Age diplomacy, cultures developed more independently. Dialects diverged, artistic styles grew distinct, and political identities layered into diverse forms. This widening cultural diversity reflected the new reality, a world no longer bound by a single, interconnected network, but by many smaller, adaptable communities capable of surviving on their own terms. Exchange persisted, but it took new shapes. Local markets, regional alliances, shared rituals, and flexible partnerships. Mobility and adaptability became the new currencies of survival, replacing the rigid hierarchies once upheld by palaces and diplomatic archives. Ultimately, the Iron Age did not rise because humanity discovered a superior material. It rose because humanity discovered the value of flexibility in uncertain times. The people who endured were not those who clung to the grandeur of the past, but those who recognized that continuity required change. They loosened their attachment to old systems, allowed themselves to shift with circumstance, and carried forward only what could fit within the narrower spaces of their changing world. Their resilience teaches a lasting lesson. Societies survive not by preserving the structures that once sustained them, but by adapting their ways of living to the realities before them. In times of uncertainty, strength lies not in complexity, but in the ability to bend without breaking, to move rather than resist, and to reshape identity without losing the thread of what makes life meaningful. The value of flexibility becomes clear through the dust of empires. It is the quiet force that guides humanity through eras of upheaval and into new ages, shaped not by the weight of the past, but by the possibilities of change. The emergence of the Iron Age. A new quiet order. In the long quiet after the collapse of the Bronze Age, the lands of the Mediterranean and Near East did not remain empty, nor did they cling forever to the memories of their fallen empires. Instead, they shifted, slowly and softly, into new shapes. What emerged was not a sudden rebirth, but a gradual weaving of fragments, languages carried by wandering families, traditions held by communities that refused to vanish, and memories preserved by those who adapted their lives to meet the world as it had become. From these fragments, the earliest forms of the Iron Age began to grow, not as echoes of the old world, but as new, quiet orders shaped by the lessons of fragility and endurance. Across Syria and Mesopotamia, the Arameans were among the most influential of these new shapers. They had wandered for generations through highlands, open plains, and river valleys, absorbing influence from the kingdoms they encountered, yet never depending entirely on any single one. When the great states weakened, the Aramean groups did not collapse with them. Instead, they settled. They built small kingdoms, bit Adani, bit Halupe, bit Zamani, rooted partly in borrowed customs and partly in their own adaptable heritage. Their writing, their language, and their decentralized political structures eventually spread so widely that Aramaic became one of the major languages of the ancient Near East. The foundations of their kingdoms carried the marks of both memory and movement, old traditions preserved in new forms, mobility turned into governance, and identity reshaped through the quiet resilience that the collapse had taught them. In Anatolia and northern Syria, other communities emerged from the ruins of the Hittite world. These Neo-Hittite kingdoms did not attempt to rebuild the grand empire that had once stretched across mountains and plains. They knew such scale could no longer be sustained. Instead, they preserved Hittite culture in smaller, more manageable centers: Carchemish, Melid, Kumu, Samaal. Here, old scripts continued to be carved, old symbols maintained their meaning, and old rituals remained alive even as everything around them took on new forms. Their cities were not as vast as Hattusa had been, nor their armies as formidable, but they endured. Their endurance spoke to a larger truth. In an age shaped by uncertainty, survival depended not on size, but on the ability to reduce, preserve, and continue. In their stone carvings, one can almost sense a quiet determination to safeguard memory without repeating the mistakes that had led to collapse. To the southwest, along the great river that had nurtured one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, Egypt remained standing, not unchanged, but unbroken. The Egypt of the early Iron Age was older, quieter, and less radiant than the Egypt of previous centuries. Its monuments aged without renewal, its reach shrank, its ambitions contracted inward along the Nile, yet the core of Egypt endured. The river's rhythm continued, its scribes maintained order, its temple rituals preserved continuity across generations. While other kingdoms vanished into ash or silence, Egypt persisted as a living remnant of the Bronze Age, carrying into the new era a memory of stability that no other region still possessed. It had not escaped hardship, but it had survived it by holding tightly to what remained essential. Farther east, in the lands that had once belonged to a sprawling empire, Assyria entered one of the most unusual cycles of decline and rebirth in ancient history. At first, the kingdom contracted deeply, withdrawing into its heartland around Ashur, Nineveh, and other ancient cities. Its influence shrank as surrounding territories broke away or fell into disorder. But unlike other powers, Assyria used contraction as a means of preservation. It stabilized internally, reorganized its administration, strengthened its core, and waited. Over generations, this foundation became the launching point for a renewed rise. By the early Iron Age, Assyria was expanding again, cautiously at first, then with increasing strength, eventually forming one of the most formidable empires of the first millennium BCE. Its rebirth was not a revival of old Bronze Age patterns, but something sharper, more disciplined, shaped by centuries of remembering what collapse had taken away. These new worlds, Aramean, Neo-Hittite, Egyptian, Assyrian, did not mirror the fallen kingdoms that had preceded them. They grew in different directions, molded by the quiet lessons written into the ruins of the late Bronze Age. The first of these lessons was that power no longer flowed from vast, interconnected systems. Instead, power grew from local stability, flexible leadership, and communities that could sustain themselves without depending entirely on external networks. The second lesson was that diversity strengthened survival. The Iron Age world was not a single cultural sphere held together by diplomacy and trade as the Bronze Age had been. Instead, it became a mosaic of smaller powers, distinct languages, regional alliances, and varied traditions. The fragmentation that had once seemed a sign of collapse became a landscape of possibilities in which no single failure could bring down the entire system. The third lesson emerged from technology. Iron allowed communities to equip themselves without relying on faraway tin or distant trade routes. Even though ironworking at first produced tools inferior to bronze, the material's availability eventually outweighed its limitations. Local smiths learned to refine, repair, and improve iron tools generation by generation, gradually transforming the economic and military capabilities of the New Age. Iron was not simply a metal, it was a symbol of independence, an assertion that survival no longer required the sprawling networks that had once defined the Bronze Age. The fourth lesson was written in memory. The new societies looked back at the empires that had fallen, not with the intention of restoring them, but with an understanding of why they had failed. Their responses were subtle, keeping traditions but scaling them down, preserving rituals while altering their practice, maintaining identity without insisting on size or grandeur. This mindfulness shaped the Iron Age into an era where strength came from moderation, resilience, and the ability to adapt old knowledge to new realities. And so slowly the Iron Age emerged, not as a triumphant dawn, but as a steady, deliberate reweaving of the world. From movements, settlements, contractions, and adaptations, new civilizations took root. Their growth was quiet, shaped not by the grandeur of what had been lost, but by the careful wisdom of those who had learned to survive without expecting permanence. The dust of empires did not silence humanity. It nourished the soil from which a new order grew, smaller, more flexible, more varied, and ultimately more capable of enduring the uncertain centuries ahead. The distant echo of Euboea, a small island's steady light. In the vast tapestry of stories woven across the long dusk of the late Bronze Age, few threads shine with as soft yet persistent a light as the one belonging to the island of Euboea. While the great palaces of mainland Greece fell into silence, Mycenae, Tyrans, Pylos, Thebes, this modest island, situated just off the eastern coast, endured with an unassuming steadiness. Euboea did not possess monumental citadels, nor sprawling archives, nor armies capable of sweeping across distant lands. What it possessed, instead, was a quieter kind of resilience, a network of small villages bound together by shared work, shared risk, and shared memory. In a world where grand systems collapsed under their own weight, it was often the smaller, humbler communities that continued to breathe. Euboea became one such breath, steady, rhythmic, and enduring. Life on the island had always been shaped by the sea. Long before the collapse, its people fished along rocky shores, tended modest fields, herded small flocks, and traded across short distances with neighboring coasts. Unlike the palatial centers, they did not build their existence on fragile channels of long-distance bronze trade or complex bureaucracies. Their survival depended on skills they practiced daily, knowing when storms would rise, where fish would gather, how to store grain safely through winter, and how to defend narrow beaches from intruders. When the Mycenaean world fell apart, when smoke rose from citadels on the mainland, and when traders vanished from familiar harbors, Euboea's communities did not face the same devastation. Their world was smaller, but for that very reason, it remained intact. The collapse on the mainland did reach the island, but like a distant echo, felt, acknowledged, but unable to break the heart of their way of life. Refugees arrived on small boats carrying stories of burned palaces and empty storerooms. Euboeans listened, offered space where they could, and learned from what these displaced people had endured. Their villages tightened their bonds. Food was stored with greater care. Fishing expeditions became more coordinated. Watchtowers, simple wooden structures, were raised on ridges overlooking the straits. Euboea did not shut itself off. It simply became more attentive, more deliberate, more protective of its fragile but enduring rhythms. In these years, the island's social fabric deepened. Cooperation became instinctive. Tasks were shared among families, tools were repaired communally, decisions were made through local gatherings rather than distant authority. No palace demanded tribute. No bureaucracy extracted grain. Authority was woven through kinship, experience, and trust. In a time when large-scale structure had proven vulnerable, Euboea's very simplicity became its shield. Its people could bend with the winds of change because they had never been rigidly held by elaborate systems in the first place. Flexibility flowed through their traditions like quiet water. As generations passed, the island's people began to sense subtle changes beyond the horizon. Travelers started to return, merchants steering small boats, wandering artisans searching for new homes, storytellers carrying tales of distant regions slowly reawakening. Euboea welcomed these travelers cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The collapse had taught them the importance of self-sufficiency, but it had also shown the value of connection. They began to exchange goods again: fish, salt, timber, woven cloth, small metal tools. Their harbors, though modest, became points of contact between worlds that were slowly stirring from long silence. One of the most transformative moments arrived not through conquest or wealth, but through symbols. New signs carved on pottery shards, inscribed on pieces of wood, traced in sand. Euboeans encountered new writing forms brought by travelers from the eastern Mediterranean, especially the Phoenicians. Unlike the complex syllabic scripts of the old palaces, these new signs were simpler, more accessible, easier to learn. The islanders, with their practical sensibilities, recognized the value immediately. They adopted the system, adapted it, and passed it from one village to another. Words that had once lived only in the breath of storytellers began to find shape in marks that any trained hand could carve. Through this quiet exchange, the earliest foundations of the Greek alphabet were laid. In-time literacy brought with it new ways of remembering, new ways of imagining, and new ways of connecting. Euboea became an unlikely bridge between the fading Bronze Age and the awakening Iron Age. Travelers stopped more frequently at its shores. Local youths learned to etch symbols on tablets or pottery. Elders recited genealogies with a clarity born from renewed memory. Songs that had been carried orally for centuries found written anchors. The island's quiet resilience had not only preserved its communities, but had positioned them to play a role in the cultural renewal that would later unfold across Greece. As the centuries progressed, Euboea's influence continued to grow, not through empire, but through steady participation in the new networks of the Iron Age. Its people founded settlements abroad, most famously at Lefkandi and later at Almina, helping shape early stages of Greek expansion. Its artisans worked metal with increasing skill. Its poets and storytellers carried traditions that would fertilize the soil from which Greek literature would eventually rise. The great works of the classical world, the Homeric epics, the lyric poets, the philosophical inquiries, trace some of their faintest beginnings back to this island that weathered the collapse quietly, steadily, and without losing its sense of identity. Euboea's story reveals one of the most profound lessons of the post-collapse world. Survival does not always require grandeur. Sometimes it requires modesty, cooperation, and a willingness to change shape without losing the core of who you are. The island did not seek to rival the palaces of the old age, nor did it attempt to rebuild what had been lost. Instead, it strengthened what it already possessed: community, knowledge of the sea, and traditions that valued endurance over display. It watched the collapse not as a victim but as a witness, and from its patient resilience emerged a light that would later help illuminate an entire cultural horizon. In this way, Euboea stands not only as a survivor, but as a quiet architect of renewal. Amid ruins on the mainland, amid shifting powers in the Near East, amid uncertainties stretching across generations, the island kept a steady flame. It nurtured memory, welcomed new knowledge, transformed what it learned, and eventually carried forward the spark that would become Greek literacy, and later still, the literature and thought of the classical world. A small island, steady in its rhythms, offered one of the most enduring gifts to the unfolding story of humanity. The lesson that resilience grows from cooperation, continuity from humility, and renewal from the quiet strength of communities that never stop adapting even when the world around them falls silent. A soft reflection on human continuity. In the quiet aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, when the great palaces had fallen silent and the long roads once lined with caravans had grown empty, what remained was not a world defined by ruin, but a world seeking its next breath. And that breath came not from armies, declarations, or grand restorations. It came instead from ordinary people who moved carefully through the shifting landscapes, making choices shaped not by force but by endurance. Survival in this era was not a contest of domination. It was a practice of adaptation, slow, patient, and deeply human. Through the rhythms of their daily lives, the survivors carried forward the essential thread of continuity that allowed the Iron Age to emerge from the dimming light of the past. Some groups chose to stay rooted in the same soil where their ancestors had lived for generations. These communities, anchored to familiar fields, rebuilt what they could after the old systems failed. They learned to rely less on distant palaces and more on the land beneath their feet. When irrigation channels cracked, they repaired them. When granaries depleted, they stored every kernel with care. Their days were measured by sunlight, harvest, and the slow cycles of seasons. In their persistence, they preserved older ways of life, not as rigid traditions, but as living practices, flexible enough to weather change. It was their quiet constancy that allowed fragments of Bronze Age knowledge to survive the periods of darkness that followed. Other groups found strength in movement. They walked across hills, plains, and high valleys, following the paths of their herds or the promise of better pastures. Their world was one of shifting horizons, and movement was their inheritance. They carried with them languages, songs, and customs that blended with those they encountered. Instead of breaking under the stresses that fractured sedentary societies, these mobile groups adjusted to the pressures with a natural ease. They slipped between regions, avoiding danger by flowing around it, and became bridges between the fading past and the emerging future. Their mobility was not wandering. It was wisdom in motion. Still others adapted through their trades. Merchants, sailors, and craft workers reinvented their roles as the world around them shrank. They shortened their trade routes, altered the goods they carried, transformed their methods, or relied on smaller vessels that could navigate new patterns of risk. Island and coastal communities, often less dependent on palace systems, relied on cooperation and shared responsibility to endure. They defended their shores, protected their harbors, and maintained continuity through collective decision-making. Their worlds were small, but within those boundaries, they tended flames that could easily have gone out. These pockets of resilience became the quiet laboratories from which later cultural renewal emerged. Together, these varied paths, rooted, mobile, coastal, craft-based, formed a tapestry of human adaptation. No single group preserved civilization, each carried a small part of it. A ritual remembered here, a tool forged there, a story retold by a wandering singer, a field tended by farmers who refused to abandon their soil, a merchant crossing a narrow strait with news and goods. The Iron Age did not burst forth as a triumphant return to order. It grew like a slow plant taking root in the cracks left by the Bronze Age collapse. Its earliest shoots sprang from the patient work of people who had learned to bend without breaking. In this way, the years following the collapse demonstrated an enduring truth. Human continuity is not protected by the most powerful empires, but by the most adaptable communities. The mightiest structures of the Bronze Age, the palaces with their thick walls, the archives with their dense tablets, the granaries holding tribute from distant regions, fell when the networks supporting them dissolved. But the smaller systems, family, village, craft, herding group, coastal community, proved resilient. They carried just enough knowledge to seed the future while remaining supple enough to reconfigure themselves as needed. As the Iron Age gradually unfolded, it did so not because someone rebuilt the world as it had been, but because people understood that the world could not be rebuilt in the same form. The New Age grew from necessity. Iron tools appeared not because they were inherently superior, but because they could be made locally without depending on faraway tin mines. Local leadership structures emerged not because they imitated old kingdoms, but because they answered the needs of smaller, more flexible societies. Cultural diversity grew not through planned development, but through the meeting, mixing, and merging of groups who had survived the collapse in different ways. From the scattered survivors came new languages, Aramaic, early Greek, and many others, born from blends of older dialects carried through migration, trade, or quiet persistence. New political shapes emerged, crafted not from ambition but from cautious growth. Assyria rebuilt itself slowly. Euboea quietly nurtured the seeds of future Greek revival. Smaller kingdoms in the Levant and Anatolia rose in forms that reflected the lessons of fragility. They grew by acknowledging limits, by valuing adaptability, and by learning that continuity required humility. The Bronze Age collapse did more than end an era. It revealed what parts of human life endure when everything else falls away. It showed that survival belongs to those willing to adjust, to plant new crops, follow new routes, build new alliances, or reimagine traditions. It showed that knowledge lives not only in grand archives but in the hands of artisans, the memories of elders, and the stories told by travelers beside a fire. It showed that when the world changes, the most resilient societies are not those with the greatest power, but those with the greatest capacity to shift their shape. Thus, the Iron Age did not rise from conquest, but from continuity. Continuity shaped by patience, flexibility, and the steady will to endure. Every group that survived the Bronze Age collapse carried a small fragment of the world forward. Farmers carried agriculture, sailors carried trade, herders carried mobility, artisans carried craft, storytellers carried memory, and together, these fragments formed the quiet foundation on which the next chapters of human civilization would be built. In this soft reflection on human continuity, one understands that the collapse was not merely an ending. It was an unwinding, a reshaping, a long breath between worlds. And it was the people who adapted, those who bent, shifted, traveled, stayed, cooperated, remembered, who ensured that humanity did not break. The Iron Age grew from their efforts, their resilience, and their quiet willingness to move with the changing winds, carrying forward the unbroken thread of human life into a newly forming world. The long quiet after the turning of an age. Instead, what remained was a gentler legacy carried by ordinary people who learned to adjust their lives carefully, moving with the shifting winds of an uncertain era. Across valleys, coasts, and high plains, small communities rebuilt their rhythms with patience. Farmers planted resilient crops. Sailors watched the horizon with renewed instinct, and herders guided their animals along changing routes. Their choices were modest, yet each one contributed to the slow weaving of a new order that rose quietly where the old had faded. Nomadic families continued their movements with deliberate grace, preserving knowledge of landscapes, seasons, and distant paths. Their mobility allowed them to navigate instability without fear, flowing around dangers rather than confronting them. In their footsteps, fragments of memory traveled from one region to another, stitching together the scattered edges of collapsing worlds. Merchants, too, carried continuity forward, though their journeys grew shorter and their cargo lighter. They adapted to new demands, shifting their roles to meet the needs of smaller markets and safer harbors. Through their exchanges, ideas moved as steadily as goods, ensuring that no community remained entirely isolated in the dimming aftermath. On islands and coastal villages, resilience took the shape of cooperation. Neighbors shared tools, guarded shorelines, and stored supplies for the leaner seasons. These communities discovered that strength did not come from grandeur, but from mutual trust and the steady willingness to protect one another when broader systems failed. In the Highlands, people accustomed to scarcity found themselves uniquely prepared for change. Their simple structures, flexible traditions, and deep familiarity with hardship allowed them to endure without breaking. Their survival became a reminder that adaptation, not stability, defines the heart of human continuity through shifting ages. As generations passed, these diverse efforts converged into the first quiet outlines of the Iron Age. New languages emerged, new materials shaped tools, and new political forms grew from local initiative rather than imperial design. The world did not return to what it had been, but it did not lose itself either. What endured most powerfully was the human capacity to bend without surrendering the essential threads of identity. Every village that rebuilt, every traveler who remembered old paths, every artisan who reshaped familiar craftwork contributed to the slow renewal that followed the collapse. Their uncelebrated actions became the foundation of cultures yet to come. In the long quiet after the turning of an age, humanity showed that continuity thrives, not through dominance, but through patience, cooperation, and the willingness to begin again. The grand stories faded, but the small ones endured, carrying forward the soft strength that outlasted empires. And in that calm endurance, the story of humanity continued, unbroken,